You know, when you look at Abraham Lincoln's life long enough, something unexpected happens. You stop seeing a tall, somber man in an old photograph, and you start seeing a mirror of loss, of endurance, of someone who kept walking even after the ground beneath him kept dissolving. You see, there's a strange kind of gravity that pulls certain people into history's most brutal storms. Not because they want glory, not because they seek power, but because something in them refuses to look away from a problem that is tearing the world apart. Lincoln didn't step into the fire because it was heroic. He stepped in because the alternative was watching his country collapse under its own contradictions. Think about that for a second. A man who had already lost elections, businesses, and loved ones willingly walked into a war that could destroy him completely. And what if, in losing everything, he found the clarity that reshaped a nation? The 19th century was not some sepia-colored place of slow carriages and polite speeches. It was noise, cannon smoke hanging in the air like a second sky, mud, cold, and hunger settling into the bones of young soldiers who barely understood the politics that sent them into battle. Farmers became fighters. Neighbors became enemies. Cities vibrated with tension, half terrified, half determined. And there, in the midst of this chaos, stood a man who looked almost too gentle for war, yet carried the weight of an entire fractured union on his shoulders. By the time the first shots were fired, the world had already shifted. The old logic states deciding who counted as human, economies built on bondage, leaders arguing about sovereignty was collapsing under the force of a moral reckoning. Lincoln saw it, felt it, and somehow found language that cut through the dust and blood, language that turned a political conflict into a human one. Not a textbook lesson, but a visceral truth. A nation trying to decide what kind of civilization it deserved to become. And maybe that's why Lincoln's story hooked me so early in my life. Growing up in South Africa, I saw what division looks like. Not in history books, but in the streets. Walls invisible and visible. Entire systems bent around exclusion. When I came to North America, I carried that awareness with me like an unspoken algorithm shaping every decision. So when Tesla almost died in those early years, when we were down to a few weeks of cash, when SpaceX watched rocket after rocket fall in flames, I kept thinking about people like Lincoln who faced far greater stakes. Turns out, building rockets feels a lot like building nations, lots of fire, plenty of misunderstanding, and a constant fear that everything could collapse in a single moment. When Falcon 1 failed the third time, I remember standing on the launch site in the middle of the night, silent, exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that makes you feel hollow. And something inside me said, keep going. Not because success was guaranteed, far from it, but because stepping back would break something deeper than a company. It would break the belief that humanity could expand beyond its old limitations. Lincoln had the same problem. He wasn't fighting simply to win. He was fighting because the alternative, letting a nation split over the question of who deserved freedom, would poison the future for generations. At Tesla, at SpaceX, at Neuralink, I've learned that failure is not the end, it's information. Lincoln lived that long before engineering existed as a modern discipline. The more I think about him, the more I see that the essence of progress always comes wrapped in paradox. You can hold moral clarity and still drown in doubt. You can want peace and still wage war. You can value unity while watching the cost of preserving it unfold in terrible detail. Lincoln understood that civilization is an engineering problem as much as a moral one. You need structure, vision, and the willingness to iterate through pain. We talk about consciousness and intelligence as if they're abstract ideals, but they grow out of conflict, the tension between what we are and what we could become. When I work on AI, or consider the fragility of a multiplanetary species, I think about how Lincoln worked through the fragility of a young republic. He didn't know if the Union would survive. Just like we don't know if Earth will remain stable enough for human life in the long term. But he acted anyway. That is the quiet brilliance of leadership, moving forward without the comfort of certainty. Humanity doesn't evolve by comfort. It evolves by curiosity, by risk, by confronting the uncomfortable truth that our future depends on decisions that may feel impossible in the present. And maybe that is why Lincoln still feels alive, not as a monument, but as a reminder that the hardest choices define the direction of civilization. In the end, Lincoln lost almost everything. He didn't get to see the long arc of the freedoms he helped set in motion. He didn't get to see a country slowly reshaping itself, imperfectly, unevenly, but undeniably forward. His life reminds me that progress isn't a clean ascent. It's jagged, costly, full of contradictions. And yet, he kept going, kept imagining a version of humanity better than the one he inherited. That's the part that stays with me. Because when you strip away politics and inventions and titles, what remains is the question of what we owe the future. Every breakthrough we build today, electric transport, sustainable energy, rockets to other planets, neural interfaces, comes from the same impulse that drove Lincoln: belief. Not naive belief, but engineered belief, the kind that survives loss, the kind that rebuilds from ashes, the kind that whispers, try again. So maybe the real legacy of Abraham Lincoln isn't the documents he signed or the battles he navigated. Maybe it's the quiet, stubborn refusal to let humanity fall backward when it is capable of rising. And now I wonder, what do we risk losing when we choose safety over vision? What futures collapse because we fear the cost of building them? And if Lincoln could endure his storm, what storms are we willing to walk into for the sake of tomorrow?